Is America's role as a global leader in decline? The U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan still reverberates across the region and beyond. Who will fill the void, and what are the consequences of the American retreat? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. America's military footprint in the Middle East has been shrinking for years. From the beginning of the withdrawal of U.S. troops in Iraq in 2007 to the most recent retreat from Afghanistan, the Pentagon's presence has declined. Despite that, President Joe Biden's administration has continued to reassure Middle East allies of its commitment to regional stability and security. But traditional alignments between nations have shifted and the influence of world powers has changed. China, among other countries, trying to fill the void left by the United States in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere. Russian military contracts for air defense systems have attracted U.S. allies, including fellow NATO members, Turkey as well as some Gulf states. But the recent U.S. approach to foreign policy isn't a surprise. Antony Blinken has this to say before becoming U.S. Secretary of State. In a Biden administration, we would see more emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, more emphasis on our own hemisphere, as well as some sustained engagement. I would hope with Africa, and obviously Europe remains a partner first resort, not last resort, when it comes to contending with the challenges we face. Just as a matter of time, allocation and budget priorities, I think we would be doing less, not more, in the Middle East. Let's bring in our guests in Washington, D.C. Hillary Mann Leverett, Chief Executive of the political risk consulting firm Stratega. She's also former Director for Iran, Afghanistan and Persian Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council. In Istanbul, in Turkey, Matthew Bryza, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. He is also a former White House diplomat at the National Security Council. From Cambridge in the U.S. state of Massachusetts, Rami Khouri, a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also Professor of Journalism at the American University of Beirut. Welcome to the program. Hillary, the picture of the last American soldier to get into the military plane at Kabul airport in August, and then the Taliban take over, was for many an iconic moment, an indication that the region won't be the same ever again. Do you see that as an indication that the Americans are starting to disengage from the Middle East?
Well, that moment was certainly iconic, important, had ramifications throughout the Middle East, throughout the world. I think most people after that moment came to see the United States as a bit weaker, as a bit less competent than they had previously. I think within the administration here in Washington, within the Biden administration, there has been some important deep rethinking, and they've come up with this policy that I think the U.S. Middle East coordinator, Brett McCurk, outlined in Bahrain a few weeks ago, which is back to basics. The United States will be back to basics in the Middle East, which does not mean withdrawal, but it does mean a strengthening of traditional U.S. relations with traditional allies, especially Israel, and one that will be focused on the use of force, not rebuilding societies, as George W. Bush tried to do after 9/11.
Rami, is it back to basics as far as the U.S. foreign policy is concerned in the Middle East? Do you see it as a real disengagement or just a perceived withdrawal?
Oh, I see it as a real threat to the region, because it's the basics of American foreign policy, as well as the autocrats in the region and many others, the Israelis and others. The basics of the last 30, 40 years have brought this region to a point of almost social collapse. You know, we just had a couple of reports that were published by UN agencies and others showing something like around 70%, 70% of primary and secondary school students in the Arab world are not able to read and write properly. They're almost illiterate. That's incredible sign of what's to come in this region when you combine it with unemployment and poverty and other things. So it's the basics that we've suffered. Foreign military intervention, 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict, unchecked Arab autocracy, rampant corruption, and out-of-control militarism, very much fueled by foreign military sales. Those basics are a real nightmare for the region. And of course, the U.S. thinks going back to basics from the administration point of view is something sensible. For the rest of us, it's really scary. And this is one of the problems that people in the region, in the Arab region especially, really have no way to confront it. The Iranians are the only people who are seriously putting up some resistance, and they're now doing it through a negotiating process.
Hillary, if this is a reset of priorities when it comes to the Middle East, or back to basics, what kind of impact will it have on the Middle East? Will it be the same Middle East that we've known for the last 6-7 decades, or is it likely to be a different one?
Well, it could be even more unstable. I think many of Professor Curry's points are very, very important, especially the one about Iran. The reason that the United States did not go quickly back into the Iran nuclear deal when President Biden first came into office was because to work cooperatively with Iran really would be to have a whole new approach to the region, one that could actually facilitate somewhat of a U.S. withdrawal from the region. The United States is really focused on keeping its influence in the region and containing Iranian power so that the United States can continue that influence and continue the approach it's taken for the past 20 or 30 years, if not longer. So there is this recalibration of priorities to what they call back to basics, but it's not one that's going to be less militarized or more stable. It's one that will, I think, in many ways, bolster our traditional what we call allies, especially in Israel, but in other places, with advanced military systems, and one that will be focused on containing any independent power, any rising power that could challenge the United States in any real way. And that focus is very much on Iran, containing Iranian power.
Rami, we've seen over the last few months Gulf state leaders saying that it's about time to mend fences with the Iranians, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And for many, this was a sign of anxiety in the region about a potential vacuum, power vacuum, if the Americans say it's about time to turn the chapter.
Well, it's a sensible thing that the Gulf leaders are doing to talk to Iran. They should have done it years ago. And we'll see what comes out of it. They're doing it in a moment of some panic and a little bit of desperation. They don't know if the U.S. is going to protect them. Some of them think Israel might protect them. A few of them might be looking to Turkey in desperation. So the Gulf countries, by and large, have not been able to fully assert their own sovereignty in terms of protecting themselves, and they're fully reliant on foreign military and other support. But this is a good thing to do. The Iranians and the Arabs around the Gulf are going to have to work out a mechanism that provides some kind of stability and basic rights for all people concerned. The military threat, the sanctions threat, all of these tough guy approaches that have come out of Washington and Israel, and very much driven by Israel, and with the Arab Gulf states kind of hanging on as bit actors in this process, it hasn't worked. And we've seen now the incredible stories coming out of Iran by good reporters, foreign and Middle Eastern ones, all saying the Iranians have a much more advanced nuclear industry now than they did 3 or 5 years ago. So the approach is failing that the U.S. has tried to impose. And essentially the shorthand of this, what Hillary said, I agree with. The shorthand of this is that what we're seeing is a new form of colonialism imposed by the United States, a kind of colonialism by proxy. You hire out tasks to local people and mercenary armies. You create the mercenary forces as they did in, in Syria. And this is a new kind of control that essentially means what Washington wants, what Tel Aviv wants, is going to be the rule of the game, and people in the region are pushing back.
Hillary, this moment of uncertainty and anxiety at the same time, do you think it will offer some sense of an opening for Iran to further expand its political influence in the region, or at least to reassert itself as a key player in the region?
I think we've already seen that. Iran has more and more deep alliances throughout the region than almost any other country, whether in the region or outside. Iran has alliances that stretch from Afghanistan and the Taliban to the Houthis in Yemen. They have alliances throughout the region. So they have already done that. I think what we're also seeing, though, is other countries gaining more influence in the region, even beyond it. So, of course, China, Russia, even France with its new military sales to the region. So you do see a recalibration in terms of the regional geopolitics and global politics affecting the Middle East. The United States is becoming perhaps less of a player than it has previously, but it does not mean that the United States is not active in the region for what it perceives to be its interests in a way that can be very, very destabilizing as it tries to fight off growing Chinese influence, Russian influence, and the growing power of regional countries, especially Iran.
Rami, quite interesting, since we're talking about those new political realignments in the region. And the UAE Crown Prince went to Turkey, the first visit in 9 years. Could it be an indication that in this predominantly Sunni part of the world, some leaders are saying if the Americans are not going to be a reliable partner in the near future, it's about time to have a strong ally that we can go to in case the situation gets worse?
I would discount what you mentioned about this predominantly Sunni. This has nothing to do with Sunni or Shia or anything else. This is national viability, national sovereignty, national dignity, and national rights. But the Arab countries are clearly, most of them, the leaderships, not the people necessarily, the leaderships are really quite flustered. They don't know what's going on with the realignments in the region, and they're thrashing around trying to find any relationships that will protect them. But they turn to Iran, they turn to Turkey, they turn to China, Russia getting more involved. These are fascinating signs, especially the Iran and Turkey relationships, because Iran and Turkey, at several points in history ruled the Middle East. These are huge powers that shaped and defined much of what happens in Middle Eastern, Arab, and other cultures today. You can't just sideline these people or sanction them or threaten them or ignore them, as the Western countries have generally tried to do. And I think we're still at a point of broad immaturity in political leadership in Arab countries, a kind of amateurism. Sovereignty hasn't worked very well. Statehood hasn't worked very well. Citizen rights haven't worked very well. Accountability is non-existent. Parliaments are a joke. So the structures of statehood in most Arab countries, not all, but most of them, have not worked. And the leaders are thrashing around trying to figure out how to hold things together. They will figure it out at some point, and what they'll realize is that sovereignty and legitimacy come from your own people, not from foreign military sales, not from Israeli spy technology, not from Chinese container ships. It's from the citizens of your country, and this is something we have to keep our eye on.
Matthew, against the backdrop of the anxiety that we've been talking about in this part of the world about what kind of role the Americans will likely play in the future, do you think that when you look at what happened in Afghanistan, the anxiety that followed in this part of the world, this is something that will have an impact on the outcome of the talks with the Iranians about the nuclear agreement? Are we likely to see the Americans saying, let's go ahead with a deal, or the Americans are likely to step back to show their allies in the region that they are very cautious about Iran's future?
I think for certain the Biden administration's preference is to get back into the JCPOA, which means Iran has to return to compliance. But I'm not sure that that's the limiting factor here. I think the limiting factor is Iran itself, which seems to be buying time in Vienna as it moves closer and closer to this breakout capability as it enriches more uranium to higher grades that'll allow it to be in a position to be able to build a nuclear weapon. So yes, the Biden administration is determined to try to get back in, but it may not have enough time. And in addition to that, I think the Biden administration overall is committed to a less boisterous or less bombastic U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, which is so reliant on phrases like maximum pressure on Iran. We recall that the whole debacle that we saw with the other Gulf states pressuring Qatar, for example, happened right on the wings of President Trump's first trip abroad in 2017, and that was to Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think those states, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, felt they had a green light in the Trump administration. Now, as Trump is gone, I think we're going to see, obviously, a much more measured foreign policy by the U.S. administration, and I wouldn't mistake that for meaning the U.S. is leaving the Middle East. I think it just means it's a different style.
Okay, Rami, where do you see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict move forward in the future?
It's not moving anywhere right now. The Israeli leadership is bent on full-speed colonialism all over the region. They're destroying houses every day. They're imprisoning kids. They're annexing more land. The Palestinian leadership is essentially non-existent. It's a virtual leadership. And what's happening is that the political activism of the Palestinian people is shifting to grassroots organizations like BDS, like media activists, like people taking up law cases all over the world, challenging Zionist extremist moves. So there's no real movement on the Palestinian-Israeli question. But what has happened is that the Palestine issue has now become one of the four global drivers of citizen activism around the world. If you look at the issues that move people to go to the streets in hundreds of thousands around the world: climate change, women's rights, Black Lives Matter, and Palestine. So this is very significant. There's a slow shift in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's going to take years, but eventually, hopefully, some wise leaderships will move into a diplomatic negotiation that gives the Israelis and the Palestinians equal rights, but nothing now.
Matthew, the Abraham Accords, do they undermine the chances of a bigger American influence in the near future? Do they still can restore the sense of faith in the peace process between the Arabs and the Israelis?
Well, those are two different questions. And I think, of course, the Abraham Accords really helped stack the deck even further against the Palestinians. And so that would be a measured yes to your question, that maybe undermines the U.S. ability to broker any sort of just and lasting settlement. However, as we just heard, the peace process is going nowhere. So the Abraham Accords have actually achieved something different. With the passing of Donald Trump's presidency and with the Abraham Accords, there's a whole new dynamic now, I think, throughout the Middle East, which is one of no more maximum pressure on Iran, much lower threat of the use of military force by the United States, and therefore new vectors of possibilities. And you could argue it's a vacuum, or you could say it's an opportunity, but Turkey is definitely stepping into this opportunity. As we've seen over the course of the past year or so, there have been high-level contacts between the Turkish government, foreign minister, intelligence chief, and the Saudi government. We just saw the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates visiting Ankara, and a whole slew of economic agreements between Turkey and UAE sort of coming in from the cold as well. And there have been warming relations between Turkey and Egypt also, which could have all sorts of implications in the Eastern Mediterranean, stretching all the way to the Gulf. So I think the U.S., if it decides not to stick with the sanction approach toward Turkey, but wants to work with its NATO ally to try to shape events in the Middle East, I think we can see a lot of U.S. influence.
Hillary, Russia in Syria, the use both of diplomacy and military power has consolidated its presence there. Could it be the next key player in this part of the world anytime soon?
I think Russia is a key player. They're a key player in Syria. They have an important relationship with Turkey, a traditional steadfast American ally. The Russians have a very important oil-based relationship with Saudi Arabia in OPEC and OPEC Plus. Russia and Saudi Arabia are now the two key drivers for the global oil market. So, and Russia, of course, is selling weapons throughout the Middle East as well. And we'll see President Raisi of Iran go to Russia, I think, in about a week or so. So Russia certainly is a player in the Middle East in a way that it has not been for many, many years.
Rami, where does it leave other conflicts in the region? We're talking about Yemen, for example.
Other conflicts, Yemen, Libya, lingering conflicts in Iraq and Syria and other places, Somalia. The world essentially has written off these conflicts. What we're seeing now is the expansion of the concept of a disposable nation. You know, Somalia was the first disposable country in the world in the late 80s, 90s, when it started to fall apart, and most of the world just didn't care. And we're seeing similar things. What not only does the world not care very much about Yemen and Libya and Palestine and other things, that they're actively involved in the military. You know, the British, the French, the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, everybody is actively involved in these conflicts. So I think we're going to just see them continue. And the underlying reason is that the social integrity of many of these countries is collapsing because about 70 to 80% of people in the Arab countries cannot meet their basic weekly and monthly needs of food, medicine, education, and shelter. So the integrity, the viability of these countries is rattled now. It's not collapsed, but it's rattling, and it's collapsing in some countries. So I think we're going to see this go on for some time.
Matthew, one of the defining moments in this part of the world was the Arab Spring in 2011. The Americans were baffled at the beginning, then they saw the opportunity for political transition and they said, we have to embrace it. Then under the Trump administration, they turned their back on the aspirations of the people. Now you don't get any indication that the Americans are willing to take an aggressive role when it comes to moving forward with the political transitions. Is this something that is just likely to perpetuate authoritarian rules in this part of the world? Well,
that's certainly been the pattern of U.S. foreign policy throughout the decades, right? To favor, quote unquote, stability over democratic reform. And, you know, as we heard earlier, I mean, real stability comes from within. You can't have stability, political stability in a country if people don't feel that there's justice. And, you know, democratic change is part of that. When Hillary and I were working together in President Bush's White House, there was a very strong push to enable the countries of the Middle East and the peoples of the Middle East to benefit from the same democratic freedoms that we enjoy in the United States or in Europe, and not to think that for some cultural reason they're not entitled to those or not able to take advantage of such freedoms. Now, in hindsight, and given what happened, what the U.S. did in Iraq, and the reputation for trying to export democracy by bayonet, and with the debacle in Afghanistan, that whole concept sounds a bit quaint, to put it mildly. And so I think for a while, you know, as we've seen with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and President Biden saying our mission there was to defeat al-Qaeda and to get Osama bin Laden, not to nation build, not to build a democracy, I think we're going to drift.
Hillary, whatever the Americans are trying to figure out and do here in this part of the world, do you think that the Chinese see an opportunity for themselves? They are very pragmatic. They use the Belt and Road Initiative. They use economy to further expand their influence. Do they see an opportunity to further move to this part of the world?
Yes, they do. But if I could, for one moment, the issue of the Arab Spring and the protests that broke out in the Middle East in 2011, because I think many of the topics that we're discussing about U.S. foreign policy are structural in their nature. But they also have, there's a huge impact in terms of who is the president of the United States at any time. And now with President Biden, I think it's really indicative of his outlook in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East to remember that when he was asked, as the protests were breaking out in Egypt in February 2011, what he thought of then President Mubarak, who was being besieged by these protests. And then Vice President Biden said that he did not see President Mubarak as a dictator because President Mubarak was a good friend of Israel. That is such an important indication of how President Biden sees the Middle East through the lens of these traditional, what we call traditional allies. For China, China doesn't see any friends anywhere. China doesn't have alliances. China has interests, and that's what it's pursuing in the Middle East.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but in time, Hillary, Mann, Leverett, Matthew, Bryza, and Rami Khouri, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.